Nika and Dick Parker, Ronzu, and never say you're the journey, never say you. Here come and a song took some room latte around the cherry.
Now, from among these instructions, we will now hear how we should proceed if we find ourselves under the influence of adverse circumstances, when all our surroundings, all sorts of people, all sorts of experiences seem to be of a negative nature, seem to be out to cause us harm and problems. Of course, the predominant instruction here is to give rise to bodhicitta, to the enlightened attitude, but how do we do so in particular?
Number something. And I can do some to get sun and in around the cherry or take down. Then don't some to get sun and around the cherry or take down. Yeah, but shepherd and around the cherry, so the number some song.
And we have heard that there are three methods which we can apply. One is the giving rise to nurturing bodhicitta in accord with the world of appearances and phenomena. One is the second is the giving rise to such bodhicitta in accord with true reality. And the third method includes all the instructions of the various different types of conducts that we could take up.
Any moves or drata, any country loss over, any Tenga Naranata, never so Momu, living with it.
The first type of circumstance that we could, adverse circumstance that we could possibly encounter, there are the various kinds of sicknesses, pains and sicknesses that could assail our bodies. We could, for instance, also be slandered by others. Others could talk in a negative way about ourselves, either behind of our backs or even to our face. And this particular kind of adverse circumstance is one of these adverse circumstances which we might encounter, which we then consequently have to deal with.
And dressing, make yigging Nara to dress in Nepathism. Elatin and Narangasana, Dominium. Make Yamba jigging Nara, Domini by Hine, and Impera Taps. Elatin and Narangasana, Dominium. $10 on your money.
Of course, as we experience such circumstances, we could easily think that there are some people out there who actively wish us harm, that there is such and such a person who might address us in such a way as to cause us harm, as to cause us discomfort, etc. Such thoughts would be wrong thoughts. We should not have such thoughts.
Ngarange Jewa Mamala, any Coronsona, Drata was in Nepa Mombos, and Domini, Cora Mombo Tap. Telatine, Tigan, Driver, then Tatangara should make money.
In the actual situation, it might indeed appear as if there is someone who approaches us with the intention of harming us, of slandering us, of cheating us, of possibly stealing our possessions from us, of causing us any harm in any which way whatsoever. This is the apparent situation. However, instead of thinking that being the case, we should remind ourselves very clearly of the fact that it is through our own negative doing, either earlier in this lifetime or in previous lifetimes, that we have caused such suffering, such adverse circumstances in the first place. So they only come together, they only come to pass because we ourselves have caused them in the first place. We are the root cause of the suffering, of the negativity, of the adverse circumstances that we experience.
then Namo Buddha, Namo Buddha. Then Yin Parabola, Dhamma Goni, then Namo Buddha, Sober Goni, Namo Buddha. Tati less up again, give it and Arona to let you mind. Tell Atene, Parabola Sangye Tingri.
If we were to examine that which we hold to be our self, which we so lovingly cling to, believing it to be real and existent out of itself, onto itself, we would clearly see that there is no inherent self-nature to that idea, the clinging to a self whatsoever. There simply is no such thing. Nevertheless, under the influence of the erroneous idea that this is the case, we have been holding on to this idea of there being a self, and under that mistaken impression, we have allowed ourselves to fall under the influence of all kinds of obscurations, of emotional defilements of whatever kind, which in turn have caused us to perform deeds which have caused others harm, which have caused others pain, etc. Therefore, the whole idea of there being a self, which causes everything that comes thereafter, is an erroneous one in the first place. Even though it might then seem that occasionally people approach us with harmful intent, having understood this point, there is no reason whatsoever to reply in kind. So it is clearly this exaggerated self-appreciation, exaggerated out of all proportion, this clinging to this idea of a self, this clinging to this idea of there truly being such a thing, of this thing having a true existence unto itself, which is the root cause of all the trouble that we experience in the very first place. So if we experience such trouble, if we experience adverse circumstances, negative circumstances, pain, suffering of whatever kind, the one thing that we ought to do is not to lash out at others, but to bring an end to this erroneous idea of there being a self and the clinging to this idea. Which in turn brings us back to the question of how are we to do this? How are we to bring about this giving up, clinging to this idea of the self? How do we give up the idea of this self in itself? And this, one of the most efficient methods of doing so is the practice that we have already heard about. It's the practice of sending and taking, the practice of exchanging ourselves for others, of taking willingly and lovingly, joyfully, taking upon ourselves all the suffering, the pain, the causes thereof of others upon ourselves, and giving all our happiness, our joy, and the causes thereof to others so that they might enjoy it.
yingin sewa nepa sewa ngaru ke sana ndik chok to donga de ju kan ri ke la tin ne yong go re sana de kin da don zamba le song wa de hin di bu da la ke yi sa ta tin nepa de tang ki de ju de ngaru dang jing ta jin jing da la tin ne nepa de yong go re yong jing de ye san ben pe jong bo tang ki ge no jong bo chen bo da don zamba ta tin ngaru na ka pen ge do
Exemplifying this point is yet another quote, this time from the Bodhicitta, the entering upon the conduct of the Bodhisattva by the great Indian master Shantideva, in which it says, even if the world were full of nothing but evil and fear, there is not a single other cause for these but the erroneous idea of an inherently existent self. How to go about, how to deal with this demonic influence, or how to deal with this demon. It says much the same thing as we have heard already. Throughout all of our lifetimes, no matter what sort of lifetime, no matter what sort of existence it might have been, there has always been ample opportunity for us to experience all sorts of sufferings, all sorts of fears, pains, sicknesses, etc. There may have been outer forces like demonic influences, there may have been inner forces like mental obscurations, etc., which might have plagued us. There might have been many combinations thereof which might have caused us all sorts of trouble and pain and fears, etc. All of these are, in the end, if we look at it, not caused by anything else but by this idea of a self, this idea that we so much cling to, that we so much hold on to, that there truly is a self existing onto itself, out of itself, that there truly is an existence, a substance to this thing which we so dearly hold to be ourself. And the quote by Shantideva continues, first the first two lines of it, there are four, and he says, again from the Bodhicitta, while wandering around in the cycle of suffering, I have been harmed by exactly this many hundredfold, many hundred times. With exactly this, he means nothing else but this clinging to this idea of a self. This is the basic root cause for all the suffering, for all the adverse circumstances, etc., that we again and again experience. And this idea itself, clinging onto itself, is exactly the cause for all the suffering, for all the pain, etc., that we have ever experienced. The second part of Shantideva's quote says, well, having been harmed, well, I have to go into the previous one as well again, having been harmed 100 times by you, by this idea of the self, full of vengefulness, I should now set out to destroy you. So this again repeats the necessity of how it is this idea, how it is that this idea of a self and the clinging thereto has to be destroyed. It is not the outer enemies that we have to be vengeful towards, but we should recognize that it was this hanging on to this idea of a self that has been the root cause for all the harm and suffering that we have ever experienced. And if there is any entity that we should be vengeful, that we should be hateful towards, then it is exactly this. And this idea of a self and the clinging to it, this is what ought to be destroyed, nothing else whatsoever.
Garden Chamboyan, Jungsin Kayana, Jer Songi Droba, your Sentin Nana, Matiba, Droba Tamepina, that's not also Songiga Compo, Drop Guna, the Songija Compo, Orobna, Revaton Dambatige, Songija Compo, Drop Guna, that's Sentina, Matiba, Sentina, Dane, I don't know Songi Compo, Drop Guna, Sentin Mana, Songi Compo, Drop Tapoma.
So this is what we have to train in. Instead of regarding others in any which way, we should recognize that it is only through the help of other beings that we are enabled to achieve the awakening of Buddhahood in the very first place. If there were no other beings towards whom we could develop kindness and compassion, etc., towards whom we could act in kind and compassionate ways, there would be no way at all to accumulate the merit that is necessary in order to proceed upon the path that leads to the awakening of Buddhahood. Therefore, we can only achieve Buddhahood in interaction through our interacting with other beings. And that being the case, all of these other beings which enable us in the first place to achieve this Buddhahood show us greatest kindness. And that is something that we should definitely take into account.
Then Padampa Sangye Tingri, and long long thing. The Charan big bag sorcerer, the Pang Google. The Charan Gewaka sorcerer, the Charan drop Google. Tatela and Lamramba Yanda, Sosu Dozatong Tempeg, Damba Mombo Dane, then around Nyamso Lane Toba, Nyamso Lane Chopa, then the Padampa Sangye Tang, then it's sending Nika, guarding Nyambares. Songi Kompong Drobala, Sentient Songi Gardi Nyambari.
This is exactly the path that the Buddha himself has taught. The Buddha has taught, train yourself in avoiding harming others, train yourself in bringing about benefit for others, and train yourself eventually in guiding others. So yet again, if there were no others, how would we train? There would be no basis upon which to train in the first place. Therefore, once we ourselves have then achieved this great awakening of Buddhahood, this is to an equal extent due to the kindness of our teachers, as well as due to the kindness of all of these beings.
Dambo, le Dambo Batamji, Sananga, Tsosago. Sananga Tsogad, Dambo, Jimba, and it turns a parado samba tolas of a song or a Tayandu, da, Sengi, Utbotang, and then Tambotang, and then Trikangdong Damba, then you get Sengi, and Tani Mena, Tang Aronto, Jimbatong, Yortani Yomarwa. Tayandu, Jimbatong, Sananga, Tsogavati, Tani Tabiyomarwa. They ended the Sanji, Utbotang, Trambo Lazoba, Jimbatong, Gonzotella, Sananga, Tsozopi, Chani, Garden Chevare.
Now, if we were to think a little bit about this statement that both the teacher as well as beings are kind towards us to an equal extent. Thinking about the teacher, let's take the Buddha as an example. His kindness is very obvious. The Buddha has come into his world, he has demonstrated the achievement of enlightenment, he has turned the wheel of the Dharma, thereby spreading the teaching, his teaching in this world and enabling us in the first place to come into touch with it and to traverse upon that path ourselves, which eventually will lead to the awakening of Buddhahood. But in which way are beings kind towards us? One of the activities, or a whole set of activities that we should take upon ourselves in order to accumulate merit, which is so necessary in order to proceed upon the path that leads to the awakening of Buddhahood is, for instance, the activities of the so-called 6 transcendent virtues, the 6 paramitas. There we have the paramita of generosity, the paramita of patience, of discipline, etc. Now, if there were no one, let's stick to the first one, the paramita of generosity. If there were no one towards whom we could demonstrate, towards whom we could practice our generosity, then how on earth should we be enabled to accumulate merit through the activity of being generous? If there were no beings in the world, like those who are poor, those who are needy of our help, our protection, or whatever it might be, then there would be no object towards whom we could practice our generosity. Therefore, there would be no opportunity for us to accumulate the necessary merit which propels us onwards upon the path that leads to the awakening of Buddhahood. Therefore, it goes very clearly without saying that without all of these beings which become the objects of our compassionate, of our virtuous doing, etc., there would be no way how we could proceed in any way whatsoever. Therefore, it is said very clearly that both the teacher, the Buddha, and all the teachers for that matter, as well as beings, are kind towards us to an equal extent.
Sambaga goni, then Chacha talking and then Songchu Samba, Damba Lang. Tangara Sanking, then Jachambu Droge in some Tamchasi. That is on the Tenga Trauma, song with her, then is an uncle chose Jimba Tonga, Soton Song, Zappa Gamba, Last of a Zini, there's an uncle Chosabari.
Even if we were to look at the Buddha himself, the one whom we know as the Buddha that appeared in our age, the founder of this teaching in our world, he himself at a certain time was just as ordinary a person as we are presently. He was not born forever, he did not appear forever throughout all of his lifetimes with all the marks of excellency, all the marks and attributes of an enlightened being, of a Buddha, like the Ushnisha on top of his head, or the marks of the Dharma wheel in the palms of his hands, etc. He was not from the very beginning endowed with the ability to effortlessly turn the wheel of the Dharma, teach the Dharma to beings, but he was just as ordinary a person as we are. Then, in the story of the previous lives of the Buddha, it is said that many ages ago, in the presence of the Buddha Shakyamuni, he made the great resolve, the great promise that from that particular moment onwards, he will strive to achieve the awakening of Buddhahood for the sake of beings. And then through an innumerable number of lifetimes, he proceeded to accumulate merit by all sorts of virtuous activities, etc., which then eventually, after a very, very long time, enabled him to demonstrate the achievement of the enlightenment of Buddhahood and to appear in this world of ours, in this age of ours, as the one whom we know as the Buddha. So that very Buddha himself, who is the fountain of all of that which we learn and practice ourselves nowadays, he himself started out, he himself practiced in this very same way as we are advised to do.
Then Kiwa Mandrawa Mobu Lang, then Kiwa Country Lang Yang, then Sanking and Jachambo Drova, and Jukonaga, Lera, Sango. Berna, then Sonji, Kapkela, Rum Cheki, Java Rum Chela Java Lambe, Castle, and Nejela, no Utpushi, Samatani, Saju Meva, and Riking Yore, then go Samasaju Menata, Trikong. Shut up, Zegore. Then he shut up to the top, Metiga, Pena, Cola, Sama Mabala, then Zupo, Desi, Sabos, Yona, Desi Pangeras, Mezi, Megun Chembu, the Jap. Tatana, Uncle, Trikong, Shell, that was a ringo. The Yagana, then, Songi, Rom, Pichia, Rom, Kali, Levione. That meant then immunity come shadow those. Tangaranga Zupote, Kola Jambatanga, then you call on Nikap Jella, then Shagamari, then you Rambajan the Yachi, Suna, then you call on Samala Sopa, Tapsusene, take on a Meshavari over there, something. Then in Ninja Chambu, round Meganona, Chongumari. Then the Meganona Chong, that make a trick door, then I shot it, and Coron take on the. There is a room we shan't go shumbo, then go take on the job somewhere.
Now here's a story of one of the many previous births of the Buddha himself, in which exemplifies in which, sometimes even extreme ways, he was able to accumulate merit, which then eventually propelled him onwards towards the achievement of Buddhahood itself. It was in a lifetime when the Buddha was born in the body, the future Buddha was born in the body of a rabbit. And one evening he came upon a scene, that rabbit came upon a scene where there was a beggar, which was extremely emaciated, suffering from great hunger and thirst, and on the verge of dying. Now this person, having already lost a great deal of his own body warmth, had at least, in order not to freeze to death, lit a fire in front of himself. Now the Buddha the future Buddha in the body of that rabbit was consumed by great compassion for that person. And he thought to himself, what could I do in order to alleviate this horrible suffering of this person? What could I do to prevent him from dying of hunger and thirst? And then the idea popped up in his mind, well, I could offer my own body so that this person could eat the flesh of my body and in this way survive. And having thought that, he then slowly approached the fire, jumped into the fire, died in that fire. The fire continued to cook and fry the meat of this rabbit, and the smell of that then revived that beggar to such an extent that he witnessed what had happened, and he saw there was freshly fried meat in this fire, which he then eventually ate. In this way, the Buddha, through his compassionate thinking, through his compassionate acting, was able to prevent that poor person from dying from hunger and thirst, and yet for himself again accumulated a great deal of merit.
And then Namo Buddha, Dharma, and then Tikong, Shavaka, and Jaru Hindu Chamber, Java Yin, they got a good.
There are many more such stories, and for instance in Nepal, not far from Kathmandu, there is a place of pilgrimage that everyone can easily visit, known as Namo Buddha. This is a particular spot where in a previous lifetime the Buddha was born as a king, or rather as the son of a king, and as he was walking in the woods with some of his friends, he came upon a hungry tigress, which was greatly weakened by hunger and therefore unable to feed herself and her cubs. And again, being consumed by great compassion, he then devised a way of killing himself and offering his own, the flesh of his own body to that tigress so that she could survive and that also her cubs could survive by way of being fed by their mother. This is a place that is easily accessible from Kathmandu and can still be visited today. Now it's very obvious that each and every one of us does not have even a fraction of the courage that is necessary in order to, for instance, even give our own bodies as an offering to someone else. Nevertheless, if, for instance, we were to travel to the east, where all over the place there are many beggars, we could train ourselves in the virtue of generosity by way of giving them something to eat, some food or drink or some money. And again, we should regard these beggars as of being very kind towards us, because without their presence, we ourselves could not train ourselves in generosity. We could not train in giving something that belongs to ourselves or to someone else.
Samba, Shantidevaquote, Pension Chamber. Then Pension Chamber going, then Maruga, Nubo Chung, the Jambatona, then Jambati, son, top Chamber Tobu. And a song, Tumbo Son, Dogan. Say, County Zang gave it our song. And Shanti Tricon, Dambaja, Summer Car Conchair, Jambatang, tell us no top Chamber, tell our song. Jambaton, Mubola, Chajun Yoma, Somba, Pensa, tell our rally.
One thing that we need to know that is of great importance is that the amount of that which we give is entirely irrelevant. It is the attitude with which we do the giving. If we give even a small amount with the attitude of truly bringing about the welfare and benefit of that person towards whom we are giving, if we do so with an attitude of kindness and love towards that being or whatever other beings we might ever give something to, then even just giving a little bit of whatever can become a very great deed of loving kindness, of generosity, and the benefit thereof will be great indeed. It is said in one of the sutras that the Buddha spoke, even if we were to give only a mouthful to a person that is starving, if we were to do so with the proper motivation of loving kindness and compassion, then that would be a very great, extremely beneficial deed indeed. Then again it is said that there is no greater evil but to allow ourselves to be overwhelmed by anger or hatred. On the other hand, it is said that there is no greater virtue but to practice, but to train oneself in patience. Compassion. Well, compassion is good as well. Patience in this particular case. This is a word that has been spoken by, yet again, Shantideva. So, again, it becomes obvious how all of these beings towards whom we can train ourselves in the virtue of patience are extremely kind, because if there were no such beings, then towards whom would we practice our patience? There would be no object towards whom we could be patient. And those who are usually closest to us, the members of our own family, could serve as such objects. Normally it is often the case that there is when we have a family, all sorts of relatives, that occasionally there are disagreements, and occasionally we give rise to anger about this or that, or some other person from within our family. Therefore, we could view them as being of extreme kindness to us, because if there were no such triggers for our anger, if there were no one who would bring anger about in ourselves, which we could then counteract by way of our training ourselves in patience, well then, how would we ever learn patience? Therefore, again, it is in this way proven how all these beings, our families and so many others, are indeed very kind to us, because without them we never would have the opportunity of training ourselves in patience and the virtue of patience in the first place.
Padampa Sangye Tingri Namo Yorne, then in Yondon Zambare, Yanayum, Rimbo Matopa, Capilla, then in Magellan, Chawa Leondoa. Chawa Leon, then Chevalana paint over it. Chevalana do that so Tartarwa, or Pay Tendawa Yori, so on. That Tendawa, then Chegel and Trupa Jeju to take. Chegel, sing number Labju to the Tani Jeju or Marisan.
There's yet another quote by the great Indian master Padampa Sangye, who came to Tibet many centuries ago, from among his 100 pieces of advice to the people of Tingri. Among all of these various pieces of advice, he says to them, all gathering together is free of any permanence. It is like the coming together of merchants on the marketplace. Therefore, you people of Tingri, do not give in to strive and fight. This is exactly what we have heard already so many times. We come together into this world, into this life. We meet all sorts of people, we interact with them, and it is as if we come together on a marketplace or in a shopping center. Once it is being opened, many people will want to get in to do their shopping, but once in the evening the market or the shopping center is being closed again, it will be empty, it will be deserted. In that short time that is given us, what point would there be to exert ourselves in fighting and strive and harming others, either physically or verbally? We should rather strive to spend that little time that is given us in a harmonious way with others which surround ourselves, all those with whom we have to interact in any way whatsoever. Now that was a very profound and good piece of advice that Padampa Sangye gave his students of the people of Tingri, and that's the kind of advice that Rinpoche also would like to give to us.
Namo Buddha, Tanji, Songju Samba, Tanji Yanada, then Chupachor Marwa. Then the Mare Maronzo Tanji, Senjin Reva. Senjin Yendu, then the Sajila Yantini, Hiadan Chadu, Topa Mumu Yundua. Then Hiadan Chadu, Topa Jedi, Taki Chupacham Ritu, Dong Number Hegri, then Kamola, then Mugawa, Nomjur, and Tabu, Nomjur. And Kadom Magdi. Tell you who knows it. Give me down and then more teach her. I did dog, two but you have not your mobile thing with it. They do that around the tea part to Bajana, that to Batulera. Then around the tea and to Bajadioma, that Zeba Gongway, that for Senna, the rich I don't try to let it, Naron and to Bajabu. That around the Zeba Gongway in some Zeba Gong. Zeba Gondo can't take Gongurana, Jazi Shavala, some. Less of Maza, not Maza, they say Shankin Nibasa, somewhere. Then soon to body yin to Cassi down, they Naranga Partella, Langen, Dodon, you bala soba, Lapa, and Zanga, and said you on my lesson. Now, Maza, Tula Tong number Cassi, he and Polity Lane here, Ben a Shingon Yin, then in the Buddha. That is Zepa company. That Zepa Tangi Gong, Naran Sanam, Yachambo, Sanam, Tso your Digba Dog, that Tige, Digba Dapa, Sanam, Tsudabat, Guarding the Troll, the Nala, then take over the Guarding Chamber.
Then again, just let's look at our families. Very evidently, all the members of our families are not bodhisattvas. If that were the case, there would be no reason for fight, for strife in any way whatsoever. We would all be happily ever after, peaceful with each other, and there would be no disagreements of any sort whatsoever. Well, this is very clearly not the case. We're all rather more ordinary people, and occasionally there will be strife. There will be fighting, there will be disagreement, one word follows the next, one deed follows the next, and either we might just shout at each other or we might even beat each other up, whatever the occasion dictates. We all know how this goes about. The face darkens, the eyes protrude, our breathing becomes faster, we become more and more agitated, etc. And here we are in the middle of the best of fights. Now, This is exactly not the way that we should retaliate, but we should rather train ourselves in the quality of what we are talking about, patience, for instance, in the face of such a situation. And there is yet another word of the great master and bodhisattva Shantideva, who has said concerning such situations not to retaliate in deed or word, but to remain as an inanimate piece of matter, like for instance a piece of wood. This is how we should train ourselves in the face of such adverse circumstances. So we should be like, for instance, as Rinpoche has demonstrated, like a piece of wood. If we find ourselves in such a situation where everybody is shouting at us, everybody is shouting abuse and harsh words and names and whatnot, instead of shouting back, instead of retaliating in kind, we should simply sit still and simply let it happen, without retaliating, without giving rise to any anger, without repaying them in kind. If we were able to act in such a way, that would indeed bring about a great beneficial virtue within ourselves. And again, in this particular case, with this analogy, it becomes very obvious how it is through the kindness of others, through their mere existence, that we ourselves are enabled to train ourselves in such great virtue as patience, etc. Now there's a great many other examples about how we could practice patience, how the Buddhas of the past have practiced patience, yet there's no time to go into these. We might continue with these tomorrow. At least there's a few minutes left for some questions, if there should be any.